Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for the second IU Maurer Law School Tax Policy Colloquium of 2021. I'm Leandra Lederman from Indiana University Maurer School of Law, and I run this colloquium, which, as you know, is in part a class for students. So now let me turn to introducing Professor Avi-Yonah, who we're really pleased to have here with us today. He is the Reuven I. Kahn Professor of Law and Director of the International Tax LLM Program at the University of Michigan Law School. He specializes in corporate and international taxation. He has served as the consultant to the U.S. Department of the Treasury and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development on tax competition, and is a member of the steering group for the OECD's International Network for Tax Research. He is also a member of the American Law Institute, a fellow of the American Bar Foundation and the American College of Tax Counsel, and an international research fellow at Oxford University Center for Business Taxation. In addition to prior teaching appointments at Harvard University in law and Boston College in history, he practiced law with Milbank, Tweed, Hadley, and McCloy in New York, with Wachtell, Lipton, Rosen, and Katz in New York, and with Ropes and Gray in Boston. He received his BA summa cum laude from Hebrew University and 3 additional degrees from Harvard University, an AM in history, a PhD in history, and a JD magna cum laude from Harvard Law School. He has published more than 250 books and articles, and I'm really pleased to have him here today with us to present his paper titled A New Corporate Tax. So with that, Reuven, why don't you take it away?
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being there virtually. I mean, it's a pity that it's not in person. I've always wanted to visit Bloomington. I've only been to Indiana once, but I'm sure I'll get a chance at some point once this crazy time is over. But of course, the advantage of doing it this way is that you really get a much bigger audience, sometimes from all over the world. So it's very nice to be able to do that. So this paper that you have is kind of the short version, which actually was published in Tax Notes. But as you could have seen, it's kind of dense. And what I hope to do, based on the comments that I get in this context and elsewhere, is to expand it to something that looks more like a law review article with footnotes and the like. So that's kind of my agenda, but I hope that you found it interesting. And so let me see if I can share the slides, because I've learned from experience teaching on Zoom that it's a good idea to have slides, even though usually I used to never have them, but here we go. So basically, the idea is to kind of start from scratch and ask the question of why we have a corporate tax at all. Because there are a lot of people, both in academia and in practice and in the various think tanks in Washington, who have argued for a long time that we really shouldn't be taxing corporations. Many economists, I don't know if maybe even most economists, thinks that the corporate tax makes no sense because corporations are not people, unlike what Mitt Romney said, and therefore a tax on a legal entity, which is only a paper creation, makes no sense, in part because we are actually unsure whom we are taxing. A tax by definition has to fall on people, and we don't know which people are paying the corporate tax. I'll come back to that point in a moment. And in addition, as anybody who has ever practiced tax in a law setting knows, the corporate tax imposes very significant costs. I mean, there's a deadweight cost that the economists have identified, but in addition, there's transactional costs. It's very complicated, and a lot of lawyers deal primarily with the corporate tax. And you can imagine better uses of their time. I mean, I practiced mostly corporate tax when I was in practice, and it's a strange tax in many ways. Now, the standard explanation why we have a corporate tax is that if we didn't tax corporations, then shareholders, typically rich shareholders, would simply put their income inside the corporation, and as long as they don't distribute a dividend or sell the shares, they would benefit from essentially indefinite deferrals. And at the extreme, under current law, if they hold it until they die, then their heirs can get a step up in basis and sell it without any tax liabilities. So we need to tax corporations as kind of as a backstop to the individual tax. But in my opinion, that's not a valid reason to have a corporate tax, given all the downside. First of all, this assumes the incidence. That is, it assumes that the incidence of the corporate tax is on the shareholders. And that is not at all clear that this is in fact the case, because for the last about 50 years, economists who are studying this sort of stuff have been arguing about what is the incidence of the corporate tax since Harberger in 1963 at least. And they haven't been able to reach a consensus as far as I can tell. Because some of them say, okay, it's a tax on shareholders, or alternatively, this was Harberger's view, it's a tax on all capital providers, because what happens if there is a corporate tax on corporations, but there is no entity level tax on the non-corporate sector, then capital would typically flow from the corporate sector to the non-corporate sector, and then over time there will be an equilibrium, and the tax burden essentially will fall on all capital providers. But that's not the only possibility. There are other alternatives. For example, it could be that the shareholders or the corporation management can reduce the wages of the employees of the corporation as a result of having to pay the tax. And in that case, of course, the tax falls on labor and not on capital. And this is in fact a common and argument for people on the kind of conservative side, that it's an illusion to think that the corporate tax falls primarily on capital, or that the distribution of the tax is primarily on the rich, because it might in fact fall on labor. For example, especially in an open economy, if the corporation can credibly say that it's going to move its efforts or its activities offshore, then maybe labor will be willing to accept lower wages in exchange for keeping their jobs. So that's another possibility. And the other option, which I think may be even more likely these days, is that to the extent that the corporation has market power, that is, that it's a monopoly or an oligopoly or something like that, then it may be able to shift the corporate tax forward in the prices to its consumers. If especially if the stuff that they sell is, as the economists would say, relatively inelastic. That is, the demand is pretty constant. And this, I think, is well illustrated these days during the pandemic by the increased profits of the big tech companies, which I suspect to some extent are shifted to consumers simply because we're all kind of stuck at home and consume much more of this stuff than we did before, and we don't basically have a choice. Like, for example, I shop much more on Amazon than I used to before the pandemic because I don't like going into actual stores, and here we go. So that's point number one. If we don't know the incidence, then we can't say that the corporate tax falls on shareholders because we don't know that that is in fact the case. Secondly, even if we do think that the corporate tax falls on shareholders, the reality is that we know that shareholders can in fact be taxed directly, and that this is probably a better way of taxing them under normal tax principles than to tax the corporation. Because if it's a non-publicly traded corporation, which now would be a minority of subchapter C corporation, but there are still some, well, then it's pretty easy, because then you just look through the corporation like you would look through a partnership or an S corporation or an LLC, and you attribute the profits directly to the shareholders. And this is in fact what happened during the first American income tax during the Civil War, where there was no corporate tax, and everything was simply attributed to the shareholders because there were no big publicly traded corporations. And as far as publicly traded corporations are concerned, which is where most of the corporate tax falls, well, there the answer, I think, is something that is actually now on the table in Washington, which is we should be taxing them on the value of their shares on a mark-to-market basis, because based on the Hague-Simons definition of income, that's the proper way. An accrual-based tax is the right way of taxing people, not wait until realization. And in this case, the usual concerns about, for example, valuation and liquidity don't exist, because the shares are publicly traded. We know every day what's their value, and we can, impose the tax, and they can sell some of them. It's very liquid, and they use that to pay the tax in case they have liquidity concerns. So I think that's, in order to avoid that, to have this whole cumbersome thing, which is the corporate tax, I think that's not justified. And then there's an interesting fact, which was recently highlighted in some academic papers, which is that as a practical matter, about 70% of shareholders in American corporations, that is equity holders, are in fact tax exempts. I mean, pension funds, universities, I mean, all of those, the large tax exempt sector. And some of people like Kim Clausing, who is now in the government and has written a paper about this, argue that this is actually a reason to tax corporations because this is and we're not going to tax them directly because they're tax exempt, and therefore this is an indirect way of taxing capital. But I don't agree with that because I think the question is, do we have a reason to exempt them? And if we think that there is a valid reason to exempt pension funds and to exempt, universities and so on and so forth directly, then why should we tax them indirectly via the corporate tax, if again we assume that the corporate tax falls on the shareholders? So for all of these reasons, I think that the traditional reason for having a corporate tax is not valid. Next slide. Let's see. Oh, here we go. I can do it. So I think that there's another reason to tax corporations. So I've been defending the corporate tax at least since 2004. And that is, I think, the original reason why we adopted the corporate tax. So here, a little history is helpful. And I'm a historian by training, so I tend to do it historically. So when we adopted the corporate tax in 1909, as a constitutional matter, we could not tax shareholders because the Supreme Court had held in 1895 in the Polo case that an income tax on individuals is unconstitutional. So the corporate tax was a way of getting around that in a way, but on the other hand, it was also there was also a direct reason to tax corporations and not individual shareholders. Essentially, what the compromise of the 1909 was that there will be a corporate tax which was held to be constitutional, and in addition, there will be a constitutional amendment proposed to tax individuals to overturn Pollock, and both President Taft and the Republican majority in Congress did not think that the amendment would be adopted. Lo and behold, it was adopted. This is the 60th Amendment, and from 1913, we also have the individual tax, but the corporate tax was adopted as a way of taxing corporation, and the reason was that if you know a little bit of American history, you'll realize this. 1909 was kind of at the height of the campaign of first the Theodore Roosevelt administration and then the Taft administration against the big trusts, the big monopolies, like, for example, Rockefeller's oil company, Standard Oil, and JP Morgan's US Steel, and all of these other huge monopolies. In fact, while the tax was being adopted, the administration, the Justice Department, was trying to litigate up to the Supreme Court against both Standard Oil and American Tobacco, which was another monopoly, and eventually they won in 1911, and they got to break them up. But it wasn't at all clear that they're going to win. I mean, actually, the litigation record before that in the Supreme Court was not particularly good. So the tax was kind of a complement to antitrust, and that's how I see it today now. And so here is a quotation from President Taft's message proposing the corporate tax to Congress. Quote, "If now by a perfectly legitimate and effective system of taxation, we are incidentally able to possess the government and the stockholders and the public of the knowledge of the real business transactions and the gains and profits of every corporation in the country, we have made a long step towards that supervisory control of corporations which may prevent further abuse of power," unquote. So that's basically, I think, why we need the corporate tax. We need it to be able to regulate corporation. In my opinion, the corporate tax is primarily a regulatory tax, and that means that you should have a higher corporate tax rate if you disapprove of the activities of the corporation, but you can also reduce the corporate tax rate by giving various tax breaks. That is tax expenditures when you approve of the activities of the corporation or you want to incentivize them. So essentially, it's a way to incentivize corporations, which are very important players in the economy, to do certain things like hire people and not to do other things like, for example, pollute or invade people's privacy or undermine democracy or all of these other things that we don't like corporations doing. And so that's my opinion why we have a corporate tax. And the point of the paper is that if you accept that that is the reason, then we should have a different kind of corporate tax than what we have now. Now, one thing that you should understand is that the original corporate tax, even though the rate was very low, but everybody understood that the rate could be raised, had certain features that the corporate tax of today lacked. First of all, as the president suggested in this quote, the tax returns were public, so that people could know and the press could know which corporations are the most profitable. Second of all, there was nothing like consolidated returns. There was nothing like tax-free mergers. all of these features of the modern corporate tax did not exist, which means that the corporate tax was much more effective in deterring the buildup of huge corporate structures, because if you don't have tax-free mergers, then a big public corporation cannot buy a startup on a tax-free basis. And if you don't have consolidated return, then a big corporation cannot buy a startup and use its profits, use the startup's losses to offset its profits. Remember, before 1969, there was no limitation on the acquisition of corporations in order to use their profits. Of course, all of that has changed. I mean, corporate returns are not public, and we have tax-free mergers, and we have consolidated returns, and we have all of that stuff. And I'm not suggesting we go back on that. We even have a dividends received deduction, that is, so dividends between corporates inside a corporate structure are essentially ignored. But my view is that the correct way of addressing this issue is by having a progressive corporate tax. So that's basically the proposal of the article. So what I think is that essentially we've had some progressivity in the corporate tax going all the way back to the 1930s, but this was repealed in 2017 in the TCJA. And so now the corporate tax is completely flat, 21% across the board, assuming, of course, that you're subject to it, which means that basically you're a C corporation. But what we should do, ideally, is to use the corporate tax to tax rents. And so there's a lot of economics literature that suggests that most of the corporate tax, in fact, falls on rents. There is so-called inframarginal returns, returns from that are not really subject to competition. So, for example, my colleague at Fox of Michigan with Zach Liskow from Yale have done a couple of pieces that suggest, so Fox did an empirical piece that basically looked at the earnings of corporations going backwards from 1995 until 2013 and asked the hypothetical question, how would the corporate tax base look like if we allowed expensing, as we do to some extent now? Because, as many of you know from basic tax, if you allow expensing, that means that the normal return is exempt. That's a so-called Kerry-Brown theorem, which I explained in the paper. So I think that we should, in fact, adopt expensing on a permanent basis, because I think normal returns, if the target is rents, and normal returns to capital should be exempt. And so we should allow expensing. But then we should have graduated rates. And I go as far as saying that we should have, at a really top end, that is above 10% of 10 billion in annual profit, we should have a rate as high as 80%, which was the top corporate tax rate historically, because that was the World War II rate on the so-called excess profits, which I can talk about in the Q&A. And interestingly enough, all the big tech, for example, had over 10 billion of profit before the pandemic in 2019. This year, presumably, they're even more profitable. And there are some other corporations. I mean, but they're mostly, I think, or almost all of them are have a monopolistic or quasi-monopolistic basically. The list is in the paper. So I think basically there are two possible scenarios that can happen if we do this. One possibility is that maybe some of these corporations would simply break up. For example, I don't think there's a particular reason why Facebook should own Instagram, or should own, or Google should own, Waze, which was a competitor with Google Maps, and so on. Essentially, I mean, one of the things that has been pretty well documented is the fact that the big tech in particular have been buying their potential competitors before they become a danger. And I think that that's a pretty bad thing. And the point of some of the antitrust suits that are now going on against Google and Facebook in particular are to try to break them up. But it is not at all clear that antitrust will succeed, because, again, our track record recently has not been that great. I mean, the government tried to break up IBM in the 80s, and then Microsoft in the 90s, and they did not succeed. And we'll see what happens with this litigation. In any case, it will take years. I think doing something like this is faster and more effective. Now, it's not clear that this will achieve the purpose, but it might. Alternatively, I mean, there are two other things that I think are potential gains from this. One is simply, we're talking about very, very successful corporations, and, we really need money. I mean, we can't borrow indefinitely. That's my view, at least. And the government needs more revenues. And I think that taxing rents, the economists would say, is an efficient way of doing it, because by definition, if it really is an inframarginal return and not at the margin, that is, there's no competition, then you don't change the behavior by taxing it, because you're going to earn it regardless, even if the tax rate is pretty high. And we can use it for the revenue for other things, like, for example, infrastructure, education, things that most people seem to think need more investment. Also, interestingly enough, all of these companies, the big tech, used to be less profitable in the early years. In fact, until relatively recently. And during those years, I think most of their resources were devoted to expanding the network rather than selling advertising and selling our data in order to, promote advertising. And I think that the former is a more socially useful activity than the latter, because, of course, the former benefits from network externalities. People like the fact that there are many other people on Facebook, but they don't like the fact that their data is used to sell advertising. And so I think that to the extent that we can shift the business model more to what it used to be, that's social positive. Then finally, there's a part of the paper that needs more development, and I would welcome any comments or questions that you have, is how do we make sure that there are no, that the new tax is not avoided. And so here I've made some suggestions. First, in my opinion, pretty clearly, we need to tax on a worldwide basis, and all income from whatever source derived. And so we need to have no deferral, no lower rate for guilty, none of this sort of stuff. We should tax across the board. And again, to the extent that you believe that this stuff is rents, then there's no competition. And if there's no competition, there's no it doesn't hurt competitiveness of American companies. That's my view, at least. Then I think you also need to address the various ways in which domestically the corporate tax is flowed. So I think, for example, that it's a mistake to allow a deduction for stock options, which is a major form of compensation, only when they're exercised, when they're worth relatively a lot, as opposed to when they're granted. And the traditional argument has been we don't know their value when they're granted, but that has not been true because of Black-Scholes for a very long time. So we know how to value them when they're granted, and that should be the amount of the deduction. And secondly, as we are supposed to be doing, I think, starting next year, there's no reason, in my opinion, especially for the very profitable companies, to allow a full deduction for expensing for R&D. The theory is that this produces positive externalities, but I'm not sure that's true for Google or Facebook and so on. And they have a really established business model. Their R&D is basically to tweak it. And I don't see, and also not a lot of people leave these companies for other companies because they pay so much more. So I'm not sure that that the R&D deduction in those cases can be justified. And tax theory would say that you're supposed to match R&D to income. And so to the extent that it produces a benefit in future years, then you should spread the R&D deduction over the years and only allow a current deduction if it's not profitable, which wouldn't be the case in the case of these companies. Also, I think that we should have no deduction from a corporate interest. That's also something that has been established over a while, that the corporate interest deduction skews the financing decision in favor of debt against equity, and that has all kinds of other negative effects. We can talk more about it. And then finally, of course, importantly, we should make sure that these companies stay American, that is, prevent inversions. In this particular case, at least for the big tech, it's relatively easy, I think, because their founders are all still alive and own the majority of shares. And under current law, if there's an inversion, they would be taxed on the unrealized appreciation of that. And so that's billions of dollars. They're probably not going to do it. But there are other ways of fixing the inversion problem. I think that it's no accident that most countries in the world don't have the inversion problem. And I think that we can fix it. So I think at this point I should stop and let's see what questions you have. Thank you very much. That I really appreciate, again, being here, and I look forward to your questions. Thanks.